does that car squat? Why does that car separate? And what the f happened here? You wanted more RC? You got it. But not this one. That's right, the Drag Slash is back with a couple changes. What is going on, everybody? We are back with another RC car tech video, and this time we're going to talk about suspension. We're going to unshroud some of the mystery and reveal some of the physics behind what is actually going on with these crazy suspension setups that we are seeing in drag racing with tons of separation. We're going to roll back and look at the old school mentality of we want the car to squat and just, get the front end up high, transfer the weight to the rear, and party on down the track. Slicks versus radials, and then we're going to look at some stuff outside of the drag racing world. So the name of the game today, for the most part, is going to be about instant center. But first, let's look at our demo vehicle. All right, the last time I put together a tech video with the RC car on the wings and the weights, it was actually one of the best performing videos that we've ever had on the channel. So clearly you guys actually kind of like the tech stuff. And I want to preface all this by saying I am not an actual chassis expert. I just got a pretty decent understanding of the physics behind all this stuff. So that's what we're going to dive into today. Now, our demo vehicle here is an RC Drag Slash with some pretty substantial changes since the last time you saw it. And the reason is the RC no prep stuff is really, really big, and it's based on like old short course trucks, two-wheel drive buggies and such. And that's my beef with it right there. It's IRS, and it's supposed to have suspension, and it barely moves. It looks cool, and it's repurposing old cars, but it's not really scale. But this is what I've been working on. So let's pop the top here. This body is an old Nissan 280Z body. I actually bought this for Logan, but I am a terrible friend and I never gave it to him. Okay, so what you're looking at is what is left of a Traxxas Drag Slash and the inner workings of the mind of a man that is very creative and often bored and also has a 3D printer. What I've designed here is a solid axle, 10th scale, basically RC car. Nothing crazy, but this is an actual true parallel four link with a wishbone, just like you would see in most drag cars today. I actually modeled this with a shorter upper bar based on the Tin Soldier no prep / small tire radial brackets. I actually have them in my own car, and then made the wishbone myself. The links are just some links that I picked up at my local hobby shop. And the rear axle is like one that I bought on Amazon for a scale crawler. The end goal here is actually to get this thing to run and work on the actual, track, street, whatever, and put a forward mounted motor with an actual drive shaft so I can kind of bring all this together. And I don't know if it'll work. It could be a steaming bag of shit. I have no idea, but it works really good for our subject today. So let's get into it. Okay, so before we get into playing with toys, we need to talk about and understand some things in order to later understand more things. A couple terms and definitions that need to go over. Some of these are things I'm sure you've heard if you've been in the racing community for even 5 minutes. Some of this stuff might be, you've heard it, maybe not fully understand it, but I hope by the end of this video, we will unshroud a whole bunch of the mystery that surrounds suspension tuning and chassis and dynamically and static and blah, 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 blah. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about the center of gravity. In order to know and understand how all of this works, first of all, we need to know where the center of gravity is on our vehicle, both horizontally as well as vertically. How do we figure that out? Well, you could go out there with a jack and raise your car up and see at what point you pick it up and it magically balances and doesn't fall. Or you could do it the safe way, the smart way, put it on scales. So you put a scale under all four corners of the car and you can figure out where your weight is applying on the tires. 30% here, 25% here, 24% all the way around the corners. So you can figure out left, right, front, and back utilizing a little bit of simple math and your wheelbase numbers, figure out exactly where the weight is pinpointed on your car. The other one we need to know is vertical. That's kind of tricky. Okay, so that doesn't work. We just go by the camshaft. We'll just do that. That sounds Sounds a lot safer. That's right, you go by the camshaft height of the motor. It's just an approximation, it's a guess, but there are some methods out there where you have the car on scales, and then you begin to raise up the front and the rear of just the chassis, and then you pay attention to when the tires depart the chat, and it's a lot of science, and honestly, for most cars at the sportsman level, and even up to really, really fast cars, it's completely unnecessary. Now, if you have a big screw-blown Hemi with a giant blower and hat that hangs over the roof line of the car, well, your center of gravity is probably going to be a little bit higher than the camshaft. But most drag cars in a front engine, rear drive application, you're going to have an engine, you're going to have a transmission, you might have a blower, turbos hanging way out front, down low if it's a radial car, or if you're no prep, it's way up high and towards the back. So all that stuff to say, we just use the camshaft height. So we know our centers of gravity vertically and horizontally now. And then the next thing we're going to talk about, which we're going to talk a lot about, is our instant center. And here's how we find that. Okay, so instant center is not necessarily strictly a drag racing term. It's actually a physics term, instantaneous center. We're not going to get into the long, drawn out, all the formulas. If you want to melt your brain, you can Google it and you can go to Wikipedia and read all the formulas and stuff. We are going to dumb this down, and luckily for you guys, I spent 21 years almost as a crayon eater, so I know how to make things real dumb. But our instant center is basically, if we could draw an imaginary line through the upper control arm and the rear control arm and see where all the way, like keep these lines, just keep them going, right? And make a triangle, and if we could figure out where out in space these 2 points would magically collide like lovers running down the beach into each other's arms. Wait, what? So at the tip of that triangle right there, the length and the height, the triangle that this forms, that is our instant center. Okay, so what do we do with all this information? Well, you can come over here to WhistlinDiesel.com. That is not a promo. These guys are not a sponsor. This is a website that's been around for a long time, and you can tell because, well, it looks like it's been around for a long time. And up here at the top, they have online calculators, and they have an instant center calculator. Now, you don't necessarily have to know the exact angles and stuff like that in order to plot your vehicle. But if you can figure out, if you got a tape measure, and you can measure from the floor up to this bolt, and the floor up to this bolt, and carry on, and so on, and so on, and so on, and you know where it all scales out because you put scales under all 4 tires, ladies and gentlemen, this will figure it all out for you, and it punches out a whole bunch of numbers and values down here in the bottom. But what do they all mean, right? So the numbers that are on the general instant center calculator here on BaselineSuspensions.com are based upon, I believe, a Fox body. And I tried to replicate that here for you guys on the table. We got rear axle center line, front spindle. Our center of gravity I've determined on this car is this little guy right here. Don't mind him. He's just here for ballast. And our instant center, I've taken this piece of rod and bent it up so I can bring the imaginary lines into reality, and the tip of the iceberg, it's bound up a little bit, it's actually a little bit lower here. This is where our instant center is. Instant center is measured, as you see here, it's all plotted out and calculated based upon a percentage. So all these numbers that they put in here are basically heights and the weights, our tire diameter, wheelbase, center of gravity, etc. And this will tell you the length and the height of the instant center. That percentage though, what is that percentage of? I think that's the most confusing part for a lot of people. And honestly, I don't know what it is a percentage of. I think of it as a force multiplier. What force, you say? Well, when you let go of the button, or you launch a car, or you just accelerate in general, there is a force that the rear axle here applies to the chassis, to these bars right here. It wants to rotate opposite direction that the tires are. So if you have 100% traction and you're accelerating forward, all the force being applied to the tire is also being applied right here. And we harness that energy and apply it to the chassis to make it react how we want to, whether that is squat, separate, or none of the above. And that 100% squat, anti-squat value, if you have that, means that upon initiation of the launch, 100% anti-squat means that this car will neither squat nor separate. Is that making sense? If it doesn't, here's how this force is created. Inside of here is a 1/10 scale representation of what we have right here. This blinged out ring and pinion set. If yours doesn't look like this, well, I guess you're just not as big of a fan of hip hop as I am, because I want everything shining. This is a 9-inch center section, the parts of it at least, out of my own personal car. So the force that I keep talking about is the pinion gear right here. As it tries to rotate, it's going to spin the tire. So we're sitting here, we're doing a burnout, right? We have no traction, ring gear's turning, it's turning the tire, but what happens when we get traction? Well, as this turns and tries to push down and rotate the tire, well, obviously the ring gear is going to resist. And what is going to happen is the pinion gear here is going to want to do what we call climb the ring gear. Imagine these like rungs on a ladder, and this guy just wants to go like this. And that force that it's applying is riding right here on the bearings. And those bearings reside inside of the nose or the snout of the center section, and they apply that force to the entirety of the axle housing, creating a torque like so. It tries to rotate this whole thing backwards, opposite rotation of the tire. But what is resisting it? The chassis, these bars right here. So as this tries to rotate, it's gonna push forward on this and pull back on this, and you get a reaction from the chassis, whether to squat, separate, or none of the above. Okay, so now I have armed you with that knowledge. How does this all apply? So we factored in all of our measurements here, and we have 111% anti-squat. Now, this vehicle has the ability to freely move, okay? The suspension in the back can squat. We can have it separate. We can have the front suspension cycle. Like, there is nothing gluing this thing to the table whatsoever. There is no trickery. There's not even shocks or springs on this thing. So when I pull back on this here with this 12mm wrench, which is the first time probably anybody has ever used a 12mm wrench in existence, but when I apply this torque, this is going to simulate the launch of the vehicle, the axle, that force being applied. Pay attention to the bars, the rear suspension here, and what the chassis does. With 111% anti-squat, this thing should basically sit still on the back. It shouldn't squat, it shouldn't separate, it should resist it just a little bit. So when I pull back here, look at that, nothing happens to the rear suspension at all. The front suspension kind of binds up on the tires stick to the table, but when you go up, there is almost zero movement whatsoever. I mean, I can see it in the wishbone down here. It doesn't go in or out, none of the above. Let's put the body on it, and it will make this a lot more clear. Kind of same story. That movement, that initial movement that you're seeing right there is more the anti-roll bar. There's a little bit of slop in the links, like the relationship of the wheel and the body here moves a little tiny bit. So there you go. 100% anti-squat, Fox body setup. Now, what about squatting? The old school mentality of launching a car, like the guys that lean against the fence at the drag strip and talk about how to tune everybody else's car, even though they don't have one that's ever ran in the past 15 years, will tell you that you need to transfer the weight. You get the front end up in the air, you get the back end down, and like a dog, and that's how you get all the weight to the rear, because you want to put all the weight on the rear car, because that's where you need all the traction. You want to maximize it and get the car going down the track. But that's not necessarily the case. So what we're gonna look at here is a video from Reaction Time Media. These are pro mods launching in slow motion. First up, we have Stevie Fast Jackson's car. Pay attention to the relationship of the wheel at the top to the fender of the car. And then also pay attention to the relationship of the body to the ground, the pitch, the angle, and all of that. We got about a 1 inch, and it gets down to a ½ an inch of difference between the body and the fender of the car. The suspension isn't really compressing that much. So where is this drastic angle change coming from, and why doesn't it flip over backwards? Well, this is a big tire slick car. These guys are running, I believe, 36-inch tires. It might be 34. I could be wrong. And they have wheelie bars on the back. A wheelie bar is not a safety device. It is a chassis tuning device. But big tire cars, if you got a small tire car with wheelie bars, it's the lamest thing on the planet. If you got a big tire car, wheelie bars are an absolute necessity. They are used to control the height of the sidewall. Pay attention to these next cars coming up here. We got Todd Totoro launching. Same deal. Car squats but the chassis and the tire actually don't change a whole heck of a lot in relationship to where they started to where it finishes on the hit. That little bit of change that you do see, that's just the inertia, the momentum, and everything kind of. They're not trying to stuff the rear axle and the tire up in the fender well of the car. That drop, squat, lowered ride height, get out and boogie, it's all in the sidewall. Look at the bottom, like you can't even read the word Hoosier. And if you pay attention, this tire actually isn't even maintaining 100% traction, because if it did, you would have this guy's problem right here. Watch the relationship of the rim to the ground on this one. This is violent. This will require you to wear a mouth guard or take a trip to the dentist. This is what we call tire shake. So pay attention to the word Hoosier. When he lets go of the button, Hoosier becomes that hoe. You just lost about 12 inches of sidewall. Where did all that tire go? It's all wadded up in the bottom there underneath the car, waiting to release and pow, pop out the back. And we're going to do that in just a second here. But look how much the rear tire has smashed into the ground. Like, you have almost half the sidewall is gone. Look at the top Hoosier, where it says Hoosier on the top there, the bottom of the H in relationship to the beadlock ring, and look at it on the bottom. They're right next to each other. This tire is so deformed, and I doubt it recovered. They might have driven through it. This is what we call tire shake. There's a difference between tire shake and tire spin and wheel hop. Wheel hop is, it's just your whole axle is wrapping up and you just suck. Like, if you got wheel hop on a track, like, you didn't come prepared at all. Tire shake is when that contact patch of the tire is glued to the track and you let go of the button and it stays there. And the rest of the tire is coming around, and the rest, this part right here is just stuck. It's like, I don't want to move anywhere. And then it's forced to. And when it comes back off the track, it pow, pops right there. When that Hoosier comes back out, that is tire shake. And you see the marks, these crazy tire marks going down the track. And you're like, how is that even possible? That is the kind of stuff that will rip a race car into pieces. How does that happen? Too low of air pressure, not enough power on the hit, wheelie bar height is the wrong setting, or the track is just really, really sticky. This past week on Sick Week, you saw a bunch of the Radial cars getting down. I mean, we saw Brett LaSalle's Mustang on a 275 Radial outrun multiple big tire cars over a 5-day average. How did he manage that? Because the tracks were prepped very, very well. That was one of the complaints from the big tire crowd, is that the tracks were just too sticky. They need that wheel spin. Why? Well, these tires are gigantic. 36-inch tire is very, very heavy. So when you let go of the trans brake button, you launch the car down the track, we try to get the tire to spin because we want to generate momentum and inertia, that centrifugal motion, to keep the tire round and avoid this, turning it into a square, basketballing, or tire shake. And one of the ways they control that is with the wheelie bar. The wheelie bar will contact the ground because wheelie bars are not attached to the chassis. They're attached to the rear axle. So that rotational force that we talked about, applying it into the chassis of the car to get it to go down the track, it's also applying that same rotational force at the back of the car, getting the wheelie bar to slam into the ground and stop that rotational force of the rear axle and hold it there. That way the tire doesn't get crushed anymore in the sidewall, and we initiate the wheel spin and the car goes down the track straight and narrow. Big tires and slicks, yo. Kind of cool. Back over here on the test rig, we got the 12mm earning its keep. The only change that I have made in order to demonstrate a squatting car is I've moved the upper bar at the front all the way to the top hole here on the test rig, which means, like we talked about, remember, we're drawing triangles. That upper bar and that lower bar, I mean, they're damn near parallel. That will put our instant center way out there. Our center of gravity has not changed. Our wheelbase, our ride height, none of this has changed. None of these numbers have changed except our instant center. It is, well, it's too far over there to even find or mark, but I made it super extreme, so it made it super easy to demonstrate this. Now, in this case, our limiting factor is the fact that the tires are getting into the body. However, if we take the body off, it's crazy. I mean, again, it still moves, but that is the amount of force it will generate. But look at the bar, the lower bar, that's all she wrote. That's all it's gonna move. But one little bar change up here, I mean, not a little, it's a big one. We went from this hole to this hole, that's all we modified. And you can see it's a completely different reacting chassis. If this was a real car, when you let go of the trans brake button, what this is basically doing is this is not applying almost no force to the rear tires. Now, there is going to be a spring and shock up here to hold the chassis of the car together, but it's going to apply so much force that it's going to smash all of that down. What you have to think of this as is, if this was an actual like bar, the distance from here all the way out to wherever the instant center is, 10 miles that way, that is like a lever. And then some guy down there has the lever and he can pick up the car and he grabs onto it just like a big pry bar and he can pick up on the front of this thing. And that's how much leverage he has. The longer that lever, the more leverage and the easier it is to make the front of the car come up in the air like so. So this is a squatting suspension, an extreme version of it. What about the opposite? What about radial cars and separation? All right, we're getting separated. No, not your parents. And we're not going to ask you which one you want to live with. We're talking about you got to keep them separated. Hashtag offspring. This is corny. Let's go. Separation, radial cars. Why do they do it? How do they do it? Well, it defies the laws of physics. When you look at it, you're like, the car is going forward. My brain tells me the ascent should go down and the front end should come up and it should do that. Why is it bulldozing down the track? Well, a couple reasons. Number one, we are driving the tire into the ground. With a radial tire car, you want to maintain 100% traction, ideally, all the way down the track. So we need to smash the tire into the ground. So we utilize that rotational force and move our instant center around in order to maximize the amount of force being applied to the tire to drive it into the ground, into the surface, and get down the track. Size for size, a radial tire car, a 28-inch radial versus a 28-inch slick, the radial should outrun the slick every single time if everything else is the same, because the radial is making more, it's more efficient with its use of the revolution of the tire. Remember, slick, right off the hit, even with or without wheelie bars with the slick, we're trying to initiate some spin. We need to keep the tire round. With the radial, it's a heavier duty construction, stiffer sidewall, stiffer construction all around. It's already gonna stay round. So we don't need to smash it into the ground initially on the hit. We need it to pour the power in pretty quick, but pretty gradually in order to ride this fine line where the tire is hooking up and going, but it's about to slip. Because if it does slip, odds are you're not gonna recover a radial tire. And the way that we do that is specific key areas of weight placement and a specific level of anti-squat where our instant center is located. And it looks a lot like this. We are watching the third-gen Camaro in the right lane that belongs to John Dock. He's a YouTuber here in North Carolina. He's local, he's a homie. But Slick Rick is a third-gen Camaro combination, not really that important. It's a radial car and it's very, very fast. And it's probably one of the best representations of a radial suspension at work. Pay attention to the distance between the top of the wheel and the fender when he lets go of the button. And I mean, it's not hard to see. Look at the ride height in the back of the car. It is scooting and booting with its booty way up in the air. And then it's even more apparent when you see the in-car footage right here. Look at the relationship of the top of the windshield to the horizon out in front. Normally, air quotes, when you think if I let go of the button and launch the car, the front is going to come up and the horizon is going to disappear, right? If I'm kind of like I'm going to go into a wheelie. But this is a proper functioning radial tire car and it looks like this. The sky is disappearing. And by the time he hits the finish line, you can't even see it anymore. That's how much nose down attitude the car has going down the track. This is an example of the extreme side of radial racing. This is a very fast car. Not everybody's radial car is going to look like this. So, how does it look on the scale side? Let's see. All right, so here's where we are. Initially, we had the bar all the way down here on the one that was 100% anti-squat, and this bar was all the way down here. We've moved it all the way up to the top. And you can see, if you drew a line, this instant center is going to be like, it's right here. Okay, remember, center of gravity is way up here. So, I mean, if I just took my finger and picked up here, it's not hard to predict what's gonna happen, right? Right, so we launch the car, we apply force, and what happens? Look at that. You see that? Back end comes up. The back end comes up and maximizes the travel before the front suspension doesn't even move. Watch it from, like, these front arms do not budge until it tops out the rear end. And the only thing limiting the rear end right now is the fact that the wishbone bottoms out. And in a real car, it would have the shock topped out. And then in a real radial car, because we're trying to avoid wheelies, we would tie down the front end to limit the amount of extension that the front end has, because if you let the front end get too high, the higher the front end gets, the easier it is for the car to get into a wheelie. That's one of the things when we talk about, like, our center of gravity height is very, very important, as well as where the instant center is. If our instant center is way, way up top here, it's a lot easier for it to make the car wheelie. If it's way down low, it's harder. It'll get harder as it comes up. Once you swing your pivot point past level, the higher you go, the easier it gets. Think of, you pick up a big shovel full of dirt, it's heavy when it's level, but the higher you pick up the dirt as you throw it over your shoulder, it gets a little bit easier to fling it. Well, when it comes to race cars and you want to fling them over backwards on a radial, it gets a whole lot easier if you let the tires hang. But if we tie them down, when the front tires hit their limitation, boom. If I had a tie down right here, when the tires hung right here, the car would probably start to come up earlier because we're changing the center of gravity on it. So there you go. That's maximum separation right there. That's I don't even know how we would plot that. That's probably 200 or more % anti-squat. This looks a whole heck of a lot like a radial car at a Ducks race going down the track, rear suspension, all goofy, and then the front tires are just hovering going down the track. Dude, I am so jazzed on how this model worked. This thing is crazy. All right. So that's drag racing. But you're probably wondering what a YouTuber who destroys everything he touches has to do with any of this. Well, let's really f this instant center. Full disclosure, this video WhistlinDiesel put up is the reason that this video that I'm doing right now even exists. And I wanted to break it down for you guys. So doing some research on this thing, I stumbled across this on the motortrend.com. They did an article on MonsterMax. This truck is massive. It's absolutely insanely big. Here's the picture right here that worked out perfectly in my favor. So it's Cody, aka WhistlinDiesel, the owner, standing next to it. And in the article, it says that Cody is about 6 feet tall. And then next to it, they put some handy little arrows. And they even put 3 of them that are about 2 feet apart, or 24 inches. Now, that gives me a reasonable level of accuracy to plot the suspension of MonsterMax here. Now, some people are going to look at this and go like, man, there's 3 suspension arms. Pay attention to that very upper arm. The upper one there is an anti-roll bar. And then you have the shocks coming down. The 2 lowest green arms are the actual suspension arms. And then utilizing this image and then a whole bunch of others, such as this one when the thing was built, where it's sitting at full squat, I kind of got an idea of where the links mount up onto the chassis. Pay attention to the lower control arm here. That link is mounted dead nuts center line with the axle shaft on the back, and that's going to play into effect when it comes to plotting our instant center and figuring out why the thing self-destructed. And what I came up with is this. This truck has an anti-squat value of 21.7%. Utilizing the internet, I said the control arm, I'm assuming, I just guesstimated on all this stuff. The upper control arm is about 60 inches in length. The lower control arm, 50, and the lower control arm is about 60. And you can see the measurements that I plugged in here based upon Cody's height standing next to the thing. I do know that the truck actually weighs 46,000 pounds because of the article specifies that the axles themselves weigh in at 26,000 pounds. So the majority of the weight is actually unsprung weight. It's the wheels, tires, and axles. Now, it may sound crazy when you think like, hey, we have a 2500 Chevy Duramax on top with 2 engines and 2 transmissions, that the weight that is actually unsprung, i.e. riding on the ground, weighs more than the vehicle itself. But when you look at it, like those axles, I think came out of like a crane or something like that. Those axles are insanely heavy. So we estimate that the center of gravity is extremely low. And because of the mass of those axles and transmissions, that means when it comes time to figure out which one's gonna win the fight of force when I'm pushing one against the other, well, a 26,000 pound axle versus the truck, it's a no-brainer what's going to win here. And then the tires themselves are actually 7 feet tall, 83.2 inches tall. And that plays into, when you look at the radius, the amount of leverage that this has on the rear of the chassis. He was riding the truck around with it jacked up to the moon, and the control arms don't kind of come together and converge towards the vehicle. They separate. So that instant center location is actually behind the vehicle. And in here you can see negative 234 inches and negative 28 inches into the ground. Now, what does all of that mean? That means when he accelerates, the truck wants to squat like crazy. The suspension will snatch the chassis and just yank it down to the ground. And then on the other side of that, when he hits the brakes, well, it's going to do the opposite. And that big gnarly tire has a whole bunch of leverage to smash the upper control arm and force the chassis to try to point the nose of that truck into the ground. And if your limiting straps are not up to the task, Bob's your uncle, everything shatters. Now, when the truck did come back out, the limiting straps are obviously much more robust. And since he's been driving the thing around in most recent videos. However, I still stand by the fact that I think there is a problem with the suspension geometry, and the limiting straps, honestly, in my opinion, are just a Band-Aid. I think the truck could perform a lot better if they move some bars around and reassessed the instant center on it. But let's see what it does on our scale model so you can actually see it in action, and I can back up my claim here. All right, so as you can see here, we've kind of simulated the bar angles on MonsterMax. The lower bar is sitting, well, roughly level. I mean, it's a little bit low, but if I brought it up, you can see both bars kind of run uphill, but the upper bar runs a little bit more uphill. So remember what we talked about in the very beginning of this, where if I could draw an imaginary line, where would these two bars intersect? And unlike most drag cars where it's out towards the front, in this case, you can see the angle. They're coming back here, and that explains this negative 234 inch bar angle, which means it's like somebody has a bar 234 inches behind the truck, and when he hits the brakes, it's like someone grabs that bar and it's attached to the rear axle to lift up on it and try to shove the pinion towards the ground. Now, how am I going to simulate the braking? Well, this is a screwdriver ran through the pinion. Because it's a monster truck, it has a pinion brake. So what you will see is that as I pull this forward right now, and I am just putting pressure on the front, no downward pressure. And when this thing hits the pinion brake, now watch. The rear end starts to go up. And because the axle tries to shove down towards the bottom, remember in the picture, all of this was angled way down. Drive shaft was hanging, dangling underneath of there, and it punted the ass into the truck up in the air like it was kicking it in the nuts because these upper bars are shoving it all the way up. Ladies and gentlemen, those limiting straps didn't stand a chance. It's not a limiting strap problem. It is a suspension geometry problem, in my opinion. So, what's the fix? Well, I think, honestly, that they need to kind of go back to the drawing board, at least move some bars around, make some new brackets, add some extra holes, and readjust. Because when you look at actual monster trucks, while they do look very, very similar, I have plotted out the instant center for monster trucks on here, and the anti-squat value of a regular monster truck is 39.26% positive. It's not on the negative, and the instant center length is 270 degrees towards the front. And it's only a 66-inch tall tire, so the leverage is substantially less. So yes, while a monster truck will squat on the launch and dive on the brake, it's not that gnarly. It's not that crazy of a length, which is why they can maintain control and keep their parts together. Again, I'm not an expert. I may be completely out in left field. Let me know what you think. If you think I am way off base here, put it in the comments below. I would love to have a technical discussion with some people on here. I hope you guys learned something with this stuff and shed a little bit of light as to what is going on in the crazy world of suspension geometry. Let me know what other, myths you would like me to bust and set this little no prep crazy contraption for demonstration up for, because I'm having a ton of fun and I'm actually learning a lot making these things. And then If you like this stuff, please like, comment, subscribe. Head over to clappedout.com/store and get yourself some merch. And then listen to the podcast and let us know how you feel. All right, that's it. I'm out. Peace.
Right. Oh, man. Dude, I hope you're okay. I know the only reason you wouldn't answer the phone is if, like, the cartel kidnapped you and was skinning you alive from the ankles up, because that's literally the only excuse I'd give a single solitary about. Pick the fucking phone up, you piece of shit. I need to talk to you. Please. Unless the cartel has you. If they have you, then my name is not Logan. It's James Tall, and I'm on the Cletus channel, the Cletus McFarland channel. James is my name, and I live in Florida. If this is indeed the cartel, find me in Florida, not in Kentucky. Okay, bye.